Empty pockets don't ever make the grade. Mama may have, Papa may have, but God bless the child that's got his own, that's got his own. Money, you got lots of friends crowding round the door. When you're gone and spending ends, they don't come no more.
Right after the Second World War, the United States began to get involved in a power struggle with the Soviet Union over problems in Eastern Europe. And as that was occurring in 1946 and 47, back in this country, there was a movement, both a political movement, mainly with pressure from the Republican Party, as well as within the Truman administration, to deal with the problem of communists in the United States. And under a lot of pressure from a Republican-dominated Congress, Truman began to take measures to have the American Communist Party defanged, as it were, to make sure that there would not be some kind of threat to quote-unquote internal security at a time when he was gearing up the country for a contest, an international contest against the Soviet Union. And in 1947, Truman imposed a loyalty security program for government employees that was designed to ensure that there would be no quote-unquote communists in government. And this was a program that was really designed by the FBI. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, had a very ideological view of what the communist danger was. And he managed, through very clever bureaucratic politics, to get his version of what the communist threat was. And J. Edgar Hoover believed that integration was a communist plot. This man was an ideologue.
In 1917, when the communists overthrew the Russian government, there was one communist for every 2,277 persons in Russia. In the United States today, there is one communist for every 1,814 persons in this country.
Right-wing critics of the Truman administration began to claim that there were communists in the government, communists in the New Deal, communist spies who had given secrets to the Soviet Union. And in 1948, they were able to drag up the case of Alger Hiss before the House Un-American Activities Subcommittee.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing if these documents were sent to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union happened to be in conflict with those of the United States.
In 1948, HUAC discovered Alger Hiss. And the significance of Alger Hiss was that they were able to obtain what looked like very hard evidence that this man, Alger Hiss, who had been a employee, fairly high-ranking employee in the State Department, had given secret documents to his accuser, a man by the name of Whittaker Chambers, who had been in the Communist Party.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting. I testified against him with remorse and fate.
and he was sent to jail. And his conviction, which occurred right in the beginning of 1950, sort of legitimized, among other things, the fact that there had been spies in the federal government. Now, 1950, this is like the high point of international tension because in the fall of 1949, the Soviet Union had exploded the atomic bomb. And a few months later, the Mao Zedong won the Chinese Revolution and took over all of China. And those two events, the Soviet bomb and the Chinese Revolution, seemed to many people to be inexplicable. Here was the United States. We'd come out of the Second World War with the atomic bomb. We had a monopoly on it. We were the most powerful nation in the free world. How could it happen? There was only one explanation for many people, and that was that there was some kind of internal subversion, that spies had given the secrets of the bomb to the Russians, and that spies within the State Department had somehow sold China to the communists.
Communist conspiracy is a deliberate and predictable plan of action to subvert the world.
Altony, Wisconsin, in a unique May Day object lesson, shows what could happen here if communism took over. The unyielding chief of police is liquidated by American legionnaires portraying red triggermen. A grim demonstration of what subversion could lead to, Modenese May Day serves as a sharp warning to all democratic community.
It's an international criminal conspiracy.
And so all of these, this scenario of internal subversion built up in the public mind. It was emphasized in particular by Republican congressmen, of whom the most notorious, of course, was Senator Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy comes to public notice by making charges about people in the State Department who, quote unquote, had lost China.
Keeping in mind that if we lose Indochina, Mr. Jenkins, we will lose the Pacific, and we'll be an island in a communist sea.
In the 1950s, when looking for communists became a useful political tool, politicians began to focus specifically on people in these areas, in the labor movement, in government, among brain workers, as it were, intellectuals, academics, teachers, writers. It's not surprising that by about 1952, congressional committees were beginning to focus on the American higher educational system and beginning to look at the whole issue of communism in education. This program that began specifically to, in a sense, protect the Truman administration during the early years of the Cold War, expanded out throughout the rest of society to such an extent that it was adopted at places, for example, like the University of Michigan.
Now this heartbreak, Carmina, Sen Opia per temporadum locum habeas. Divisit durcissima, o universitas, atos hover dicite, veatae soratas. O gloria victoria, o tecus omnio, o salve universitas Michiganensium, Michiganensium.
One of the things that the president faces so often, and this was true in this area, was the defense of the right and privilege of faculty to pursue their fields of learning without let or hindrance. That's vital to a university's concern. And that, however, immediately leads you into the suspicion on the part of many that universities are the harboring grounds for the elements that seem to be the subversive elements.
Well, heck, as a developing human being, I was most impressed in my teenage years by the Depression in Colorado. I lived in Pueblo, Colorado, where there was a big steelworks. My father worked there. Whole steelworks closed out. Most of the men in the town were unemployed. It was a terrible time and had a very profound effect on me. It caused me to feel completely alienated from the economic system that we lived under then, alienated even until today.
I grew up on a farm in Oregon. In the very early 30s, I finished high school, and because the farm would only barely support a family of 6, I went on the road. Picked up a local freight car and traveled wherever there was work. Now that wasn't uninteresting because one of the people I traveled quite a bit with is Woody Guthrie.
My self-image as a rebel as a child was based on affiliation to a movement. See, I'm talking about the 30s when it seemed to be a lot clearer than it later was what the movement consisted of.
Ken was a red darker, baby. What do you mean by that? He sucked in Marxism with his mother's grub.
So I stowed away to New York and stowed away aboard a ship. I went to Le Havre in France with the help of seamen on the ship, and then went to Paris and under the jurisdiction of the committee that was sending volunteers to Spain, proceeded down through France, walked across the Pyrenees at night, and joined the International Brigades in the very beginning of 1938. I was put in the front lines in a few weeks, and was there until the end of the time of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain, which was until December 1938, essentially 1 year I was there. And during that time, I engaged in all of the battles of the brigade, including getting forced back across the Ebro River, being surrounded by the fascists, being back at their lines for a couple of days, losing my best friend in battle. The fighting there was really very severe. I was in the front lines all the time. Occasionally we would have a few days out. The fatalities were intense. In the very first major engagement where we were surrounded and where I had to escape finally by swimming across the Ebro River, only about 50 out of something like 500 persons survived that amount. All told, about half of the Americans who went to Spain were killed. Well, it was pretty hard to imagine that subsequent battles were going to be worse than the ones I'd already gone through successfully. I did have a very big debate with myself right after I came back, whether I should go back to school and complete my education, or whether I should enter a, so to speak, a career of complete political activity. That was potentially attractive to me. I'd been very active in the communist movement in Spain. I was a member of the Communist Party of Spain. Was one of the committee of 5 that was responsible for party activities for all the Americans in Spain. And I gave serious thought to become a political functionary. And then I decided that further education and development would make me a superior person to what I was then. And I decided against that, went back to school.
In the development of economics and so on, the principle of common ownership of the means of production was such a powerful thing that I wanted to be part of the organization of pushing for that. I didn't want it something that important to fall into the hands of people who I didn't trust. I thought it was better for me to keep my hands in it.
I was graduate student in mathematics at Harvard from 1946 to 1950. I got my doctorate in 1950. And from 48 on, married. My wife was a student in history. And we were active on the left throughout this period at Harvard. We worked for the presidential campaign of Henry Wallace, for instance. That's where we met. And in 1950, when I was looking around for a job, my thesis director got me a job at UCLA, which I was very happy about. But I was also concerned about the dispute at the California campuses about the requirement of non-communist oath as a condition of employment. I was, in fact, in the Communist Party at this time. If I had had to go and had to sign, I would have quit the party. I wasn't considering signing falsely. But I didn't want to go at a time when it would be undercutting the very excellent campaign that was being waged by professors there against the oath. So I kept in touch with them, and we actually had visits at Harvard from some people from California, report on how things were going. And when it became clear that the fight was being lost and that there would be an oath requirement, I resigned the position at UCLA, which I'd accepted, and looked around for another job. And so then, belatedly at the last minute, we fortunately got the possibility of going to Ann Arbor, and we're very happy there. Really, really happy with the department and with the way of life. Enjoyed the Ann Arbor milieu very much.
University of Michigan knew very early on that it was going to be investigated. In main congressional investigating committees had not focused on higher education in the early 50s. And it wasn't until 1953 when I think they ran out of more glamorous targets, when they were, they used up Hollywood, they found all the spies in government they were going to find, and they were running out of targets. And so they focused on higher education. And in the spring of 1953, all of the main congressional investigating committees began to look at communist subversion in education. And Michigan knew that it was going to be investigated.
I became president of the University of Michigan and therefore a member of the American Association of Universities. These were then, I think there were 49 of the leading universities together. This was even more an active question because the McCarthy hysteria and the extremes to which they were going had become entirely apparent. They were very destructive, and the question was how to preserve the integrity of our institutions in the face of that threat.
I do remember the times about the time of the Nickerson and the other cases, that at that time there were quite a number, I don't say how many, half dozen or more, of our people who I had been told by the FBI were going to be called, or likely to be called, before Kit Clardy's committee because they were communists. And I decided to go down and talk to the staff of the American Activities Committee because I had, and I told the FBI, I told them I'd cooperate with them if they had any real evidence, but I certainly didn't want to see them ruin some of our best people by saying that they were communists.
set the telegram on as a direct indication, first of all, that we were going to be in full compliance with the law. Secondly, that we felt that this was the proper way to get access to communication in defense of those whom we were certain were being falsely dragged into accusation on the grounds of their alleged associations that were perfectly legitimate and entirely beyond reproach. It was for the defense and preservation of our integrity and of our faculty from persecution.
I went down and said, I have been talking with your agents and so on, and they tell me that you're going to call 6 or 7 people up there, and I'd like to have their names. I thought I knew what they were anyway, but I'd like to have them. And I was able to say, you're going to make yourself look completely silly because you hadn't anything on this except that one time at some social affair that some communists visited him.
Really, following that, we were able to get in touch with Clardy, who was the chairman of the subcommittee, who was to come here. So he notified us with great fanfare, and we thought for political motives, and most unjustly and unfairly, that they had a list of 15 or 20 of our people that was going to have them investigated at Lansing before committees. That seemed to us to be outrageous. And how would you deal with it? It seems to us the best way to say, let's best get at this. And so I asked Marvin Nias, who was our vice president and dean of faculties, the equivalent of the provost under present circumstances, to go down to Washington, which he did. And as a result of our efforts, and with this tactics, we were able to clear it completely and remove from any public display all but 3 of our members of our faculty.
I spoke with President Hatcher and Vice President Nias in autumn of 1953. Told them that I'd got the subpoena, that I expected to get the same treatment which my father and many others had been getting from congressional committees in the preceding months. And in particular, I expected to be asked if I was a member of the Communist Party, and I expected to refuse to answer. I even told them, I believe, that I was expecting to refuse without pleading the constitutional protection of the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. I told them that I was reluctant to discuss the thing publicly, that I didn't think that my politics should be discussed in a context of accusation, that they should be discussed as part of the political discourse. This was something in which I had already written a few short pieces. I had thought about this before my own subpoena came. It was important to the whole intellectual climate in the period 1947 to 53, and I thought about it a good deal. They told me the AAU position, which of course I knew perfectly well, having written against it, and I told President Hatcher that I disagreed with the position of the Association of American Universities on the that it was but the refusal to answer the question on Communist Party membership created a presumption which the faculty member must dispel, that he was under intellectual discipline, making him unfit for university faculties.
I was very startled at Michigan one day to have the FBI come to my office and ask me to identify several people that they showed me pictures of. And I said, well, I don't recognize any of those, but even if I did, I wouldn't identify them for you. I'm not willing to cooperate with you on anything. You guys are really the enemy, I said. And they said, well, if you don't cooperate with us and testify to us in private, then you will have to do that in public. I said, well, so be it, and I'll do it in public, but I'm not going to cooperate with you at all. So they left, and in fact, shortly thereafter, I was served with a subpoena to appear in public before the Clarity Subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify publicly. And that led to the hearings in East Lansing and to my suspension from the faculty.
I received this subpoena quite unexpectedly. It's dated the 6th of November, 1953. I knew from other people's experiences that these things were usually postponed, and this was no exception. The fellow that served it came back every 2 or 3 weeks until the final hearings in May, and kept asking me, was I interested in talking to the committee on a private basis so that my name wouldn't come up and I'd probably save my job. But the obvious implication and what I knew about these things was that in exchange for that, I was expected to name other people's names. And I didn't. It's something I couldn't do. Now, one of my associates, a mathematician, apparently did this. And when the chickens came home to roost on the friends he'd mentioned, he killed himself. Very promising young mathematician. So the whole purpose is to scare people.
Were you ever scared?
No, I don't think I was scared.
When you're called up before a congressional investigative committee, you have two choices. Either you can become a friendly witness or an unfriendly witness. And what I discovered when I was doing research on this, and I talked to people who had been both friendly and unfriendly, was that this is a moment in which your whole sort of, to use an old-fashioned term, character comes into play. And it's a kind of moral dilemma that many people, I didn't feel I could judge these people. Many people are called up and they had once been in the Communist Party, have left it. They were no longer politically active. They were involved in their careers. And they're called up by committee and they're asked to name names. And they know that if they don't name names, they are going to lose their job, probably. And what you have here is a sort of personal trait, I think. I wouldn't even quote bravery. I think it has to do with a kind of political integrity that people either have or don't have, and it depends how strongly they feel about it.
It became clear that the principal thing they were worried about was Operation Mind, and they badgered me about that at considerable length, but I refused to discuss it or anything connected with it. At the time, Operation Mind was something which we knew had upset the committee. It wasn't surprising that the committee was trying to punish those who issued Operation Mind, but it was also clear that the best way to reduce the damage was to reduce the number of people who were associated with it, and it was so obvious that it didn't need to be said. that anybody who was questioned about it would avoid implicating others. The original text of Operation Mind was written by my wife and Libby Duvan, who's still at the University of Michigan, and many of the others who worked on it were in the university community. But of course, we wouldn't add to the list of victims.
So that when it turned out in the committee hearing, actually, that the main thing they seemed curious about with respect to Chandler's political activities was the pamphlet Operation Mind, which the committee had distributed on campus. And the reason that they were interested in him with that, because it was, as he has indicated to you, as Chandler told you, it was really Natalie and I wrote the thing, and Chandler and a group of students typed it, and then Chandler was the one who made out the check to pay for the printing when the thing was ready from the printers. But it was like, it appeared to be, from the questioning of the committee, that it was that sort of accidental thing, that he was the treasurer of the organization, never signed a check, that got the finger pointed at him. So it was eerie.
When I was given the subpoena to appear before the party committee, that opened, we might say, a Pandora's box of all kinds of political issues that I knew I was going to have to fight through, even though I didn't want to have to do that. I wanted to be a scholar, which is my goal there. So I first of all talked to my friend Nickerson, who I knew also had received a subpoena. And then indirectly we heard that Davis had also received one. I didn't know him before that time, however, but I did know Nickerson, since we had the same major professor at Johns Hopkins, Nickerson preceding me. But nonetheless, he'd come back to visit, so I knew him, and was friendly with him at Michigan also. And there were a lot of discussions among us as to what would be the proper kind of political response to the subpoena. We knew we had to reply to the subpoena, of course. And what should be our stance? Should we refuse to testify before the committee on the grounds of the First Amendment, or grounds of the Fifth Amendment, or just stand silent and say nothing?
Is it correct that you were president of the Bookshop Association of Baltimore in the year 1944?
I decline to answer that also on the grounds that the question is an invasion of the freedom of speech, belief, and association guaranteed by the First Amendment.
Witness, I am not quite clear. Did you say the First Amendment?
I did both times.
Oh, witness, I think that is a proper question, and the chair therefore directs that you answer it.
Or without wishing to imply any lack of respect for the First Amendment, which is really the cornerstone of our Bill of Rights, I should like to decline also on the grounds that the questions inflict with the guarantee provided by the Fifth Amendment to the effect that a person shall not be required to bear witness against himself.
There was a routine established. If you did make the Fifth Amendment plea, you didn't get a contempt citation. If you failed to, you did. So I was planning to be cited for contempt. And the reason I did was, in the first place, a matter of communication. Witnesses like my father, who argued both that the hearings were an attack on free speech and that they were being asked to incriminate themselves, found that nobody paid any attention to the first of these points, that the second point was picked up. That was the one that prevented you from coming to the courts, and that was what the committee noticed for that reason, and that was picked up. So you didn't get to make the other point. That's one reason for not invoking the Fifth. The other reason is that by making the point without the Fifth Amendment, you could be cited, and so you could renew the attack in the courts on the legality of the hearings. Now, and this was my program.
The First Amendment was a risky thing. I didn't feel with 3 children, or at least I had 2 children when the Clardy hearings were held. I had 3 children by the time the university got into the act in June. I couldn't take the chance that Chan Davis could. And he was, indicted for contempt of committee. So I used the First and the Fifth Amendment, which is not as correct a position as the one he took. But it was the one that gave me more leverage with the university committees to put the university in a bad light at bottom. And it was the one that was safe as far as being able to support my family.
When somebody like Margaret or Nickerson was called up before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked, were you now or have you ever been? That person couldn't say, well, I was in the party in 1938. I joined because I was sympathetic to the party's opposition to Hitler. And then after the war, I left it because I got involved in my own work and I didn't think the party was very useful anyhow. Because you couldn't just say that. The House Un-American Activities Committee immediately would then say, and who was in the party with you? And usually they had a list of names already prepared. And they would say, was so-and-so in the party, was so-and-so, and you were supposed to name names. And if you, at that point, refused to name names, you were liable for contempt of Congress.
Well, did you know Dr. Ginsburg?
I declined to answer that on the same ground.
Did you ever hear of Dr. Ginsburg?
Again, I will decline to answer on the same ground.
I asked, did you direct the witness to answer both of those questions?
I do not think the Fifth Amendment is properly invoked in refusing to answer those specific questions.
I still decline to answer on the previously stated ground on the advice of counsel.
Very white.
Any kind of association that people like Clardy could show between me and the Spanish War and what went on there, they felt was derogatory. And I thought it was the exact opposite. Was proud of my participation there. But I didn't want to talk about anything substantive before the party committee, because in my view, the government is mine, represents me, has no right to ask me anything about my political opinions or activities. So I refused categorically to answer any of their substantive questions, pleading the Fifth Amendment, as my lawyer had advised me.
They verified that I was not invoking the Fifth Amendment. But they didn't try to understand the argument I was making, nor did I think it important that they should. By the way, you must remember that there were only a couple of committee members and the council speaking to me. It was not the full committee. The hearing took place in Lansing, and they had a small team come up from Washington for the occasion. But back to the question about the Fifth Amendment. You see, I had very close relations with a lot of people who were subject to obloquy at that time for having refused to answer on the basis of the Fifth Amendment, including my father, but many others. And I did not consider myself that they had proven themselves guilty. Well, some of them were communists and some were not. But aside from the fact that it didn't prove whether they were communists or not, I didn't consider that they had done the wrong thing. I was just doing another right thing. And it was very important to me not to set myself against the people who had already taken the Fifth, the people who were going to take the Fifth on the same day that I did.
The procedure through which McCarthyism spread from the federal government was essentially a two-stage procedure, in which was divided into first a identification stage in which supposed communists, supposed subversives were identified. And then the second stage was that of punishing these people. And these two stages were handled by very different groups, usually. The first stage, the identification stage, usually was handled by the government, either through the mechanism of a congressional investigation or a state investigating committee.
Unless, if I may interject, Mr. Scheer, unless if it is a fact that you are today and for some time have not been a member of the Communist Party, can you not see that a frank statement to that effect will be in your own self-interest? I should tell you now, that we had had a number of witnesses before us who have frankly admitted past Communist Party connections, and I'm talking about people in the educational field in some of the greatest schools in the country. Of course, the one from which you come and from which I graduated is, I think, in the top rank, but at any rate, those people have had no sanctions of any kind visited upon them when they frankly and freely cooperated with the committee and aided us in our search for fact. And I think you are defeating your own purposes if it is true that you are no longer a member, if you refuse to admit it, as was the effort of Mr. Scheer to get you to admit a moment ago. And I want to put it to you again. Now, I'll make it a very simple question. Are you now, today, a member of the Communist Party?
I still must decline to answer that question on the previously stated ground. Proceed, Miss Perry.
Because of this separation, that first stage of identification was McCarthyism. But the firing of people who had taken their, the Fifth Amendment for a congressional committee, or the firing of people about whom the FBI dropped a file on somebody's desk, that wasn't McCarthyism. That was something else. That was often justified in terms of national security, in terms of the fact that, and this is, you have to sort of get yourself back in the mindset of people in the early 1950s, you know, right after the Soviets had the bomb, China went communist, in which there was a witch hunt going on. And a lot of people in private institutions felt very concerned that their institution would be damaged if somebody whose loyalty was somehow in question remained on the payroll.
If a person takes a Fifth Amendment, let us say, that's his legal right to do it. But in this kind of university setting, in the unique situation of the 1953 and 4, you have the question, if you take such an amendment, you say to the public that there is some reason why you must do this. And that leaves the university with the question, do you ignore that or do you take notice of it? And in the procedures that we had, that was something that we could not simply ignore. So we took it under our general, and we took the least and the only possible action that was available to us under that circumstance, which was to suspend without prejudice and without and with continued salary, while this was cleared up at least within the family.
After the hearings, which didn't bring out anything, of course, of significance, we returned to Ann Arbor, and shortly thereafter, the president of the university, President Hatcher, sent a car out with a letter to me at my home in Saline Valley Farms, which is not far from Ann Arbor. And the letter said that I was suspended from the university because I had refused to carry out my duties as a citizen and testify before a congressional committee. Well, that opened up the political battle. Well, sure. It was near the end of the term. I was suspended with pay, to the credit of the university, but I couldn't desert my students so abruptly, so that the suspension was kind of superficial. I continued to make up the exams, to grade the exams, and the colleagues in the zoology department who pinch hitted for me were just front, and I continued essentially to teach the course to the end of the semester and hand in the grades as I felt I morally had to do.
A messenger came from the president's office the day after my testimony before the professional committee with a written statement that I was suspended with pay. The fact that we were suspended after we testified in Lansing was expected. The fact that the presumption would be that we had to do some explaining was well known. They were frank about that. That was a national policy. I felt that President Hatcher exaggerated when he said there are the university presidents who were doing this. There were variations, but it was normal. We knew it would happen. We weren't even sure that we would be suspended with pay. It turned out it didn't make much difference because it took them such a short time to fire us, but we were suspended with pay.
As a member of the university, was also a citizen in the United States, and the Constitution gives the citizen the state certain rights. I didn't go beyond the rights given to me by the First and Fifth Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. So I think it was unjust and unfair to suspend me for that reason. But I didn't think it was unfair.
The fact that Markert and Nickerson were going to take a different approach before the committee was known before we went to Lansing. There were no great surprises for any of us in the testimony in Lansing. The fact that we would be suspended quickly was expected. The fact that we would have a fight on our hands was expected, and we knew what the strengths and weaknesses were. We knew that Markert and I had the strength of very strong support from our own departments, and Nickerson did not. We knew that I was taking a risky position from refusing to answer comparable witch hunting questions before the university committee, and that Markert and Nickerson were not. And so these things were all given. And I must say my attitude, and I suppose those of the other two, was simply that the most complete victory would be to save all of our jobs, and saving the job of any of us would be a quite significant victory in itself. And that's the way I felt after it was over. I thought 1 out of 3, well, okay, not bad.
I knew that there would be a lot of pressure after the hearing, so I already started looking for other possibilities of places to move and changes that might be made. The big pressure was from the time of the hearing until the time of final dismissal. And after the hearing, I had no illusions that whatever I did, I get fired. Seaver he was much stronger than the dean of the medical school, and I suspect stronger than the president of the university. He could see to it that I got fired, and so all that time, although I tried to make it so that the firing would reflect as badly as possible on the university, but they couldn't claim I hadn't been candid with the official Senate committee, etc.
Immediately there were hearings on the part of faculty committees, and they interrogated all 3 of us at length individually. And here there was a significant political issue at stake, in which the 3 of us were not exactly in agreement. Particularly Chandler Davis had a different point of view. I felt then, and I feel even to this day, that a university faculty is a community of scholars that is, to a large degree, self-governing, self-disciplining, self-appointing, and in a sense could dismiss people if they didn't fit the requirements of the community. I had no reservations whatever about trying to persuade my colleagues that I was a worthy member of that community. In fact, I thought I was exactly the kind of person that ought to be a professor. Highly critical, objective, dispassionate, scientific, logical, and I was actually pleased with the opportunity of talking to the faculty. I had no reluctance of telling them anything they might want to know about me. Naturally, I was totally unwilling to be an informer on anyone. That to me would be a gross immorality that I under no circumstances would do. But the faculty didn't want me to do that. Clardy wanted me to do that. The government wanted me to do that because it debased the witness, for one thing. They wanted to humiliate people in public. Even if they knew every name that you could give them, they still wanted to make you crawl on your hands and knees by doing that. And I absolutely refused to do that. They could have stood me up in the wall and shot me. I would have never done that and didn't ever do that. But to talk about myself, oh, in my arrogance, I was kind of pleasing. I was glad to display to them this wonderful kind of person that I thought I was.
Most academics who were unfriendly witnesses took the position that Margaret Nickerson did, which was that they saw a distinction between a congressional investigating committee and a academic investigating committee, and they were willing to discuss their political affiliations and their past membership in the Communist Party with that academic committee, largely because the academic committee was not going to ask them to name names.
I was, in a sense, forced to speak under pressure by the faculty committees, but that didn't trouble me because I was quite willing to express myself on all these issues anyway. If I had my free choice, I would have rather had a cocktail party at my home and had the faculty come over. Let's have a bull session about my political views. That would have suited me far better. But here they had to ask me questions and I had to answer them, or at least put in the position of answering them. And I must say they were quite reserved in the way they asked me the questions. It was clear they did not want to have the appearance of attacking me or aggressively trying to put me down. They really gave me the maximum chance to say what I wanted to say and were fundamentally quite satisfied with the nature of my answers. Nobody condemned me or being secretive about that. I said, some things I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to talk about other people, for example, but since they didn't want to know that anyway, that wasn't an issue. So anything you want to know about me, I don't say it voluntarily. You ask me and I'll certainly be more than delighted to tell you what a fine person I am.
I wrote several times to the presidents of the committees, and in reply to their request for what my reply was to the university's charter. And I have to start out by saying, I believe that these charges are this and that and the other thing. And I'll answer those if they're not wrong. If I'm wrong about what the charges really are, let me know. Nobody has yet.
If they had declared themselves active members of the Communist Party in the atmosphere of the 1940s, they would be unemployable if they pursued it. But that was one element of it, and the other was the degree of communication between them and the university with respect to the questions that were raised.
Before the ad hoc committee first met, I explained in public statements that I regarded questions before them as to my relation to the Communist Party and other left-wing organizations as being a mere continuation of the exposure campaign of the House Committee on American Activities. I think, frankly, that they recognized that. I think it would have been possible to embarrass them. I don't know to what extent others attempted to embarrass them at the role they were playing.
People like Davis, who made the connection, the political connection, between the Academic Investigating Committee and the Congressional Investigating Committee, and who were essentially staking out a very large area around their political rights, around their First Amendment freedoms, and that area also included the university as well as a congressional committee. There were very few of those people. I think it is the fingers of one hand.
They asked a variety of questions, and all the variety of questions were leading in one direction. That is, say just how far left you are. Left to them meant just how close to the Communist Party you are. That was the crime. That was the only thing under investigation. They were not interested in my thoughts on free speech. I don't know if they had any.
All of these people who refused to cooperate with your university investigations were fired.
The Smith Committee was acting like interrogators to a very considerable degree. The Campbell Committee was pleading with me to change my position. If I had said to the Campbell Committee, all right, you're being so avuncular and supportive to me, I will change my position, I will tell all, I don't know what they would have said. I think it's rather ironic that these committees of my senior colleagues found me unfit to belong to their community on the basis that I might, in some hypothetical situation, if I had the power, not be a friend of free speech. Because what they were essentially doing was saying, we will suppress you on the hypothesis that some other time, some other place, you might suppress somebody else. In other words, convicting me of doing essentially what they were doing themselves at that moment. I expected some sophistication. They wrote with as little understanding of what I was claiming the issues were as the committee investigator would have done. They haven't understood what I was saying. No, I feel that this was not entirely my fault. They had been the fault of my youth. They knew that I didn't have tenure. They knew I was only 27 years old. But I don't feel it was my fault in speaking unclearly.
The major things were to get rid of Davis and myself in as expeditious a fashion as possible. In my case, largely because chairman of the department wanted to get rid of me, Davis treated them, and perhaps it was the correct position, in the same way that he treated the Clarby Committee. That my politics, my political race are none of your business. I did change my position with respect to the Committee of College, which was a separate committee. And I, in essence, challenged the university. All right, you say you have to be candid with your colleague. I'll be candid with my colleague, and let's see if my colleagues, all the Senate, its constitution and rules and regulations, has any influence on how the university is run.
I think the chief problem boiled down finally to the very difficult one of in the medical school, where an additional element was added. The president was faced with, at that point, with conflicting recommendations as to what was the thing to do.
What was the use of me appealing to the full Senate committee when I knew I was, in my own mind, I would get fired anyway? The purpose of doing that was to put the university in as much embarrassment as possible. I mean, the Senate at Michigan thought they were, in fact, in charge of the university and its academic policies. Having their committee, which was unanimous, absolutely rejected, I think did something useful to stir up the faculty and senate at the University of Michigan.
Nickerson's and my position were virtually indistinguishable politically in every respect. Word by word, they weren't absolutely identical, but they're basically, no court could draw any very serious distinctions between us. They had the same outlook, behaved the same way, they used the same lawyer, pled the Fifth Amendment, much the same attitude on these things. And that he should be fired and that I should not is a gross miscarriage of justice. I think because he was fired, not because I was kept. The justice was miscarried. And the reason is that, first of all, he had tenure, and I didn't. It seemed clear to me then, and now also, that it was the intention of the university in keeping me just to let my term expire and not renew it, and that would be disappear. And that would be an easier out for the university. With Nickerson, he had tenure, they either had to fire him or keep him. They couldn't wait till his term expired. And in the medical school particularly, they didn't like Nickerson as a person. They felt this was their only chance to fire him, and so they strongly came down on the side of dismissing it. And the university, to its shame, went along with that and did, in fact, dismiss it. If he had been in my department of zoology, I think he would have been kept just as I was. And if I'd been in the medical school, I would have been fired too. I feel sure.
The actual charges against me were never stated. The university never stated. None of the committee are stated. It was all a smokescreen, that in the aggregate, how can we be sure that you didn't do this and that you didn't slide around that corner and etc. But they never stated the charges, and they never stated why they found me.
And I made it also clear to my faculty colleagues that I thought they had a right to know what kind of person I was and whether I should be a professor or not. I thought I should, and here's the reasons. I tell them what I believed and why I believed it, and how I got to the point of view that I did, and about my past communist activities, why I still believed that way, but found that explicit activities as a member of the Communist Party were futile, and that the party was not really a satisfactory political and social agency for furthering the values that I had anymore, and that therefore I wasn't active politically. But as far as my views are concerned, they haven't changed substantially at all.
Marker, I think, may well have been the only untenured faculty member at a public university who took the Fifth Amendment before a congressional investigating committee and kept his job. I mean, his case was rare, really rare, because untenured people were let go like that.
I thought it was going to be touch and go, whether I was going to continue my career in science or selling insurance or some other alternative. But I didn't really seriously worry about that. I was equipped with maybe an inordinate amount of self-confidence. I figured I could survive no matter what, one way or another. But I thought that the danger of my being thrown out of academia was really very great indeed. In fact, when the hearings went on further and we had more and more battles at the university, my political position with reference to the battles was sort of the following. I pled the Fifth Amendment. If I can do that successfully as a non-tenured faculty person, and in effect force the society or the university to accept that as proper behavior, that will have been a great political victory.
He appeared to me, and he appeared to the committees, as a person of integrity. Our only question about him was that we felt that he might well have, from the university's point of view, have spoken properly. We not only retained him, but valued his services, and I think he was a splendid person. And I must say that when the opportunity came for him to go to Johns Hopkins, that Milton Eisenhower, a friend of mine who was president of Johns Hopkins, called me personally to ask about my recommendation and about his situation at the University of Michigan. I told him exactly what I've told you. I said we'd be sorry to lose him, He's a wonderful person, has great future, but if you can do better by him, we'll wish him well.
So,
There's such a contrast to these. You can imagine, if not consciously, subconsciously, what a contrast this would make between a person you were dealing with in the case of Mr. Blackwood and these other, the other two who were defiant and not forthcoming and not honest with the forthright.
After the initial resolution of the conflicts at Michigan, and I was retained, but my future was still uncertain there, I received many offers to take up academic positions at other institutions. Without engaging in self-flattery, I was an up-and-coming young scientist, well known throughout the country in the scientific circles in which I worked. And I had many friends who wanted to help me. And they asked, why don't you just depart from Michigan and accept a job here and take everybody off the hook so they don't have to decide about you? And I responded very strongly that I was not going to do that, that the University of Michigan was either going to have to give me tenure and keep me or fire me, that I was not going to voluntarily leave and take them off the hook. I wasn't going to allow them to escape from their responsibilities. I would under no conditions accept any other job or consider any job until my position at Michigan was finally settled.
I guess I was going grocery shopping. I stopped and spent some time off Chan while he was babysitting for Aaron, was taking care of its little boy. And we stood outside and he told me about the fact that what was worrying him was that he hadn't had a new idea in mathematics for the last few months, and that he was concerned that maybe he wouldn't have any more new insights, any more original ideas. I mean, that seems, given my age and experience now, that seems like both very poignant, but also very charming. I mean, there were lots of people who go through life never having an original idea in mathematics, and here he was scared because a few months had gone by and he hadn't had one. And there certainly was not really any danger that he wouldn't continue to be productive and original and insightful in mathematics. But I think that's a measure of the extent to which he felt the loss of that structural support of, going to the office every day and being surrounded by mathematicians who were all sort of in areas where at least they could just have casual conversations that might touch off something in each other. I think he felt very isolated, and I'm not sure, in retrospect, if he remembers that so importantly, but to me it was a very moving and made me very angry to think. It makes me very angry to think that people could do that today.
My wife and my elder son were the only ones that were in a position to realize what was happening, but it was on the radio and in the newspapers every day. I think particularly my son, who was 7, was quite affected by it. It was his job to keep our veranda clean, but he hadn't counted on garbage being dumped on. So I had to help him with his cleaning up jobs, and that was, I think, quite educational for him. Also, he was hassled by schoolmates a bit. Your father's a communist and a subversive. If he isn't, why did he have to go to Lansing? And simply on the basis of discussions at home that he'd overheard about constitutional amendments, 1st and 5th, and so on, he spontaneously came up with the answer that my father went to Lansing because there were some people there that needed to be taught about the Constitution. Touché.
Wrote letters to mathematics departments all over the place. I wrote more letters in the course of job hunting Anybody else did at that time. This is 1954, 55.
And then it was finally settled when the regents gave me tenure and said I'd have no further trouble, promoted me to associate professor with the professorship looming not far down the road. Then I was free to consider other possibilities. And it was at that time that Johns Hopkins, where I had obtained my PhD, asked me to return as a professor to take the place of my major professor who was retiring, a kind of unusual gesture. Most professors would think that was a mark of special recognition, that he should be invited to come back to take your former professor's position at his retirement. And I, after some consideration, accepted that offer.
I never got an offer again. My friends got offers someplace. I never got an offer.
Well, one of the first jobs that I found in Canada was in the Department of Surgery at University of British Columbia, where I was being hired for the purpose of developing the research laboratories, not as cutting surgeon, which I'm not. Everything had been worked out. I went to Vancouver. The professor of surgery had the money and made the arrangements for the facilities. But at the last minute, after I'd come back to Ann Arbor, the appointment was vetoed by the dean. I don't know what the basis of that was, but I've heard that since then, that Dr. Sievers had known the dean, that the dean was a man from the United States who hoped to come back as a dean in the United States and didn't want to touch me on that basis.
When my court case was taking longer than I thought it would, and when I was not finding a job in the United States, I turned down jobs from Canada because I wanted to pursue my court case within the United States. Not that it would have been morally or legally wrong to do it while not present, because I was out on bail. I could have got permission of the court to take a job in Canada, but because it would have been less clear.
In a very real sense, I did feel like a political refugee in 54. There's no question that it was because of politics that I had to get a job. But I think as much as anything, it was the hassle. I wasn't getting away from the long arm of the United States.
Everybody should realize that the whole commotion at Michigan was provoked by Congress, by the House Un-American Activities Committee, by the whole aura of the McCarthy era. The university itself was only responding in accord with its ability to respond. It would have never taken an aggressive action against any of us if the government hadn't put the finger on us, as it were.
We close the issue and move on. And you can't go back and undo it or change it. And I'm sure that if you had a different context, you might have it come out with a different view. But in the context of the 1953 and 4, and under the circumstances that prevailed, we did the very best level best we could, and spent hours of pain and anguish over it. And we came out, I think, about as well as could be expected.
I don't know if I can claim to have contributed very much to academic freedom, but I certainly feel that I tried.
Initially, I was quite bitter about the period. But I don't think I am too much now, because I kind of feel like I won it. I proved to Sievers that I could do as much or more in a little provincial medical school as I could do at the University of Michigan. I proved to him that there was no way he could finish my career in pharmacology. And I got a great deal of satisfaction about becoming president of the American Society. I didn't really need the extra work, but I did it specifically to show him before he died that I could, as president, invite him. And he did show it.
I think that it's sort of good for the sake of political conversations to be an ex-U.S. political prisoner, because when people explain to me how there aren't any political prisoners in the United States, it gives me a very crisp answer. I was in prison because I had decided that something was important enough to take a position which might result in my being in prison. And in that sense, I was, the whole thing was a witness for free speech in the same sense that the conscientious objector is making a witness for refusal to make war.
Well, aside from
Why did you do it, or how could you do it? I don't know really what I'd say. I'd probably throw at them as my personal model, and the things they tried to do would fall under that. It's a very bad luck, but I use as my personal motto, illegitimate, non-carborant. Don't let the bastards grind you down.
What do those kids know about it? I remember Chuck saying, thinking about this the other day, you know, they really could get you. They could get you fired. Miriam and me and the baby, what would we do if we couldn't afford the apartment? They could put you in jail. It really makes sense to be scared. Then Chuck said, but I asked myself, what's the worst they could do to you? They could kill you. And I thought, what am I scared for? Kill us, that's all. I faced that every morning before breakfast in the South Pacific. This was quite a long time ago. We all laughed a little. Then Miriam told the one about the interrogator, complaining, what do you do with these people? I threaten them and they don't break. I put them in prison and they don't break. Torture them. What are you supposed to do? Well, you offer them $8,000 a year and they break right away. $8,000. This is quite a long time ago. My wife and I joined in. We all laughed till he ate. The laughter came easy, unencumbered, because we knew that that could never apply to us. A few years later, they offered me $10,000 a year, and I took it. A few years after that, one morning, doing my routine check to see if I'd changed, well, what I had. I looked around to see if my friends had noticed, but they hadn't. They were gone. And now when I'm thinking about this, does it really help to hear this reassuring voice that's telling me the parable of Alice? After she went down the white rabbit hole, and all those changes and all those adventures, she came up again, but she wasn't the same Alice. Yes, I know. I can even cap the parable. She didn't come up by the same rabbit hole. But saying the book was the same rabbit hole, and her mother was glad to see her, but it wasn't the same mother. I know. The trouble is, oh reassuring voice, you mean the parable and the cap to be a premise. And the conclusion has to be that I should stop running about. But I should not submit myself to moral judgment by 4 silly lacking 24-year-olds many years ago. You have other premises to throw at me, such as they weren't perfect anyway. Use you're telling me. Your premises are fine, but the way they bounce off me and away in the wind. I stand my ground. I squint my eyes. I cup an ear. I strain through the dim to hear that distant judgment.